Hi everybody, it's Ms. Dupree. In this video, which is the second of this little series, we're going to be looking at the properties of metals, nonmetals, and metalloids. And we'll also look at where you can find these different types of elements on the periodic table. We will use the describing words that we learned in the last video. So they are states of matter, solid, liquid, or gas; luster, shiny or dull; malleability, malleable or brittle; ductility, ductile or not ductile; and conductivity, conductor or insulator. Ready? Let's start. We're going to start with metals. All metals share the same basic characteristics. They are solid at room temperature. The only exception to this is the metal mercury, which is the only metal that is actually liquid at room temperature. Because mercury is liquid at room temperature, it used to be used in thermometers until we learned that mercury is toxic to humans and the environment. But besides mercury, all the other metals are solid at room temperature. Metals are very shiny. Think of all the metal things around you. Metals reflect light very, very well, very easily. In fact, metals are so shiny that some mirrors are made out of metal. There's aluminum mirrors and stainless steel mirrors. They're not always made out of glass. So metal's shiny. Metals are also very malleable. You can take a chunk of metal and you can hit it with a hammer and it won't break. It will just bend. And because metals are malleable, they can be very easily hammered into thin sheets, and that's how they make aluminum foil. Many metals are also ductile, which means they can be stretched out into long, thin pieces without breaking, and this is why wires are made out of metal. Most wires are made out of copper, which is this orange-red color, but other metals can be made into wires also. And then finally, here we have metals are conductors. That's why we use metal wires to carry electricity to our homes and in our devices, and why we use metal to cook with and to iron our clothes. They conduct heat and electricity really, really well. So if you look around, you probably see metal things, but more things that are not metal. So it surprises people to learn that the periodic table is almost all metal, about 90 or so of the 118 elements. The total amount of metals on Earth is limited, but there are lots of different types of metals. So you can see here the metals start on the left side of the periodic table, and then they stretch out almost all the way to the other side. Okay. Be sure to color in the metals on your periodic table and color in the little color key. One thing I want you to notice is that the only thing on the left side of the periodic table that is not metal is hydrogen, which is over here in the top left. Hydrogen is a nonmetal, which is our next group of elements. There are 20 nonmetals on the periodic table. Out of those 20, most are gases, a few are solids, and only one, bromine, is liquid at room temperature. But even the nonmetals that are solid are still very different from solid metals. Nonmetals can be very colorful, but they do not have luster. They do not reflect light, and they're not shiny. They're dull. Nonmetals are also brittle, which means if you hit them with a hammer, they'll break instead of bending. And they're not ductile. You can't stretch them into wires. Nonmetals are insulators because they do not conduct electricity or heat. So if you think about it, nonmetals are pretty much the exact opposite of metals. So let's take a look at the periodic table. Except for hydrogen, which we talked about earlier, which is over here on the left, it's a nonmetal. All the rest of the nonmetals are found over here on the right side of the periodic table. You can see them right here. So be sure to color in the nonmetals on your periodic table. Okay, so if metals and nonmetals are exact opposites, then what's left? Well, there is one last group called metalloids, and they're pretty interesting. They're kind of the in-between elements because they have some properties of metals and they have some properties of nonmetals. Now, because they're so different, scientists sometimes have problems agreeing on which elements are actually metalloids. One thing that we've been learning in science is that nothing is 100% certain in science, and things can change. So for our class, we're going to identify 7 metalloids. Now you might see other periodic tables on the internet that have more metalloids, and that's okay. Just know that we're going to color in our periodic table with 7 metalloids. Make sure you get them colored in now. Notice that the metalloids are here, and they're in between the metals and nonmetals. And again, think about it. That's because they're the in-between elements that have the properties of both metals and nonmetals. So let's look at the properties of metalloids. They are solid at room temperature, and they can look a lot like metals if they're shiny. And most of them are shiny, but they can also be dull. They are brittle, which means that they break easily. So they can be shiny like metals, but they're brittle like nonmetals. They are not ductile, so they're more like nonmetals there. But they can conduct electricity, kind of, like metals. They don't conduct electricity all the time, like metals do. Instead, they conduct electricity best at higher temperatures. So the higher the temperature goes, you can see here's silicon, which is a metalloid. It doesn't conduct very much at all at lower temperatures, but as the temperature rises, it starts conducting more and more electricity. And because they only kind of conduct electricity, or they conduct electricity only some of the time, they are called semiconductors. But that's actually a really, really good thing. Semiconductors are great if you want to control when you want to conduct electricity. In fact, semiconductors, like silicon, are used to make computer chips because sometimes you want the computer chip to be conducting electricity to send a signal, and sometimes you want it to not be conducting electricity. So without silicon, you would not be able to use your cell phone, and you would not be able to watch this video. So there you have it. You should now be able to describe the different properties of metals, nonmetals, and metalloids, and also be able to identify where these elements are found on the periodic table. If you have any questions, please ask. Otherwise, you're all set. Good job, everybody. See you next time.